He rose from the sand like a myth the regime could sell, a lean, sunburnt commander in a field-gray uniform whose daring maneuvers and personal charisma turned defeat into headline after headline. On newsreels, he was the desert fox, the soldier who struck fast and disappeared. In Berlin, he was a trophy for a regime that needed heroes. Yet 5 years later, that same figure was offered a bottle of poison behind closed doors, told to take it to spare his family and the reputation of a shattered Führer. How did a man so publicly trusted become one of the symbols of the Wehrmacht's loss of faith in Adolf Hitler? The answer lies less in a single betrayal than in a slow, accumulating collapse, strategic errors, ideological intransigence, and a moral breach that made professional soldiers withdraw the confidence they once placed in the supreme commander. Erwin Rommel's rise was not the product of propaganda alone. He carried with him a lifetime of soldiering that began in the trenches of the First World War. A junior officer, he learned small unit leadership in bitter, chaotic conditions, lessons in initiative, improvisation, and the value of speed that would mark his later career. Between wars, he read, experimented, and watched the new machinery of mobile warfare emerge across Europe. When the Wehrmacht reformed and rearmed, he translated theory into practice with a kind of practical genius, rapid, decisive thrusts, flexible use of terrain, and an eye for exploiting hesitation in an opponent. Those traits were stunned into public relief during the spring and summer of 1940. In the campaign of 1940, Rommel's name rose quickly. As a panzer and infantry commander in the invasion of France, he moved with a confidence that looked like instinct. Where others hesitated, he advanced. Where plans bogged down, he improvised. That combination, competence under fire and a visible appetite for aggressive action, made him both an asset to the high command and a perfect subject for Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. The Nazi press liked heroes who conformed to their narrative, fearless, energetic figures who embodied national will. Rommel, perhaps unexpectedly, fit neatly into that mold. The nickname Desert Fox, born of the North African campaign that followed, belonged as much to public relations as to battlefield reputation. But the man beneath the headlines remained, by most accounts, first and foremost a professional soldier. North Africa offered Rommel his greatest stage and his clearest triumphs. Sent with the Africa Corps in early 1941 to support Italian forces, he turned a limited reinforcement mission into a sustained series of tactical successes. Against often superior numbers and in a harsh, logistically difficult theater, Rommel repeatedly applied the principles that had made him admired in France: speed, surprise, and aggressive local counterattack. He took Tobruk in 1942 for a moment of high drama. At times, his opponents seemed to be answering a conductor's baton rather than an opponent. Hitler took notice, as did the German public. For a time, Rommel's battlefield exploits insulated him from the worst political storms inside Berlin. His celebrity created a kind of two-way protection. It made him useful to the regime, and it gave him a degree of autonomy, command latitude that junior and mid-level officers rarely enjoyed. That autonomy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, being a chosen national symbol bought Rommel the operational independence to move swiftly, to press local advantages, and to act with the initiative the desert favored. On the other hand, it placed him inside a political spotlight where his successes were used to paper over strategic weaknesses elsewhere. Hitler rewarded brilliance, and sometimes rewarded it with trust he did not extend to others. Rommel's rapid promotions, culminating in his elevation to field marshal, were less only the mark of battlefield competence than the political calculus of a regime that wanted a living emblem of martial vigor. But campaign ribbons and promotions do not feed armies across the Mediterranean.
The same mobility that made Rommel so effective was also fragile. It depended on fuel, on long lines of supply, on the reliability of a shipping route stretched across the sea. North Africa was never self-sustaining. Italian defeats, Allied interdiction of convoys, and the expanding industrial weight of the United States after Pearl Harbor combined to tilt the arithmetic against the Axis there. The arrival of American ships and troops meant that the strategic balance in the Mediterranean would shift. Quantities mattered more than audacity. By late 1942 and into 1943, desert tactics alone could no longer compensate for the steady attrition of materiel and the tightening noose of Allied logistics and air power. El Alamein, where Bernard Montgomery halted and then reversed Rommel's offensive in late 1942, has become shorthand for the moment the tide turned in North Africa. It was not a single disaster so much as the crystallization of a problem that had been growing. Local tactical skill could not solve global industrial imbalance. The Afrika Korps fought with courage, and Rommel remained a creative commander, but the loss at El Alamein, followed by the Allied invasion of North Africa in Operation Torch and the eventual Axis surrender in Tunisia, demonstrated that success in isolated theaters could not compensate for failing strategic calculus elsewhere. In early 1943, as Axis forces capitulated on the African mainland, Rommel himself was suffering from exhaustion and illness and would shortly be pulled back to Germany. The campaign had burned its brightest and left the regime with a glaring strategic vacuum.
While these operational realities were shrinking the space where Rommel's style could win, something else was shifting in his mind, an internal, moral reevaluation that would harden his distrust of the political leadership. The Wehrmacht had always contained a spectrum of attitudes toward Hitler, from unquestioning loyalty to a grudging professional allegiance. For Rommel, the cumulative effect of defeats was not only tactical frustration, but a growing inability to reconcile the promises and goals of the regime with the actual conduct of the war. Reports from the Eastern Front, rumors at first, then more concrete accounts of mass executions, reprisals, and the machinery of the concentration camps began to reach officers across the fronts. The brutality and ideological fanaticism that underpinned German operations in the Soviet Union troubled many professional soldiers who saw warfare as a domain governed by rules and military purpose, not a theater for genocide and ideological ruthlessness. Rommel, who had long been skeptical of party politics and whose loyalty lay with his men and with the idea of Germany's defense, reacted to these reports with visible dismay. Those who observed him in the years that followed describe a man who had been hardened by war but shaken by what he learned. His disillusionment was not only moral, it was practical. When the leadership pursued ideological aims at the cost of sound military practice, insisting on holding untenable positions, diverting resources to politically motivated ventures, or ignoring clear operational necessities, professional officers saw their duty to the nation compromised by the Führer's stubbornness. Stalingrad crystallized that tension in an especially brutal form. The disaster at Stalingrad was more than the collapse of the Sixth Army. It was an existential shock to the German officer corps. There, Hitler's refusal to authorize a retreat, his insistence on no step back, and his meddling in the timing and manner of military operations left even experienced commanders appalled. Military logic demanded flexibility. Ideological posture demanded sacrifice and symbolic stands regardless of cost. The result was catastrophic. Rather than responding to a collapsing front with realistic maneuver, Hitler committed resources and will to symbolic resistance, a pattern that repeated throughout 1943 and 1944, unraveling the professional calculations on which experienced officers had relied. For Rommel and many of his peers, Stalingrad was proof not only of a battlefield reversal, but of a strategic culture that had gone profoundly wrong. It is important to stress nuance when considering Rommel's reaction.
He was not a civilian moralist suddenly discovering evil. He was a soldier whose horizon of judgment was shaped by battlefield effectiveness and a sense of duty.
Yet hearing reports of massacres and seeing how ideological imperatives distorted military priorities made him question whether Hitler's leadership still served the national interest. It was not a neat moral epiphany, it was an accumulation of evidence, consequences, and conduct that undermined his faith in the man he had once followed with professional respect. A son's memory provides one humanizing window into this process. Manfred Rommel, who would later enter public life himself, described his father as a soldier whose primary loyalty was to his men. He recalled private conversations in which his father spoke with a rare mix of bitterness and sorrow about the price the country had paid. He loved his soldiers, Manfred would say, and the implication was precise. When the leadership's decisions jeopardized the welfare of those soldiers for reasons besides military necessity, loyalty frayed. That personal perspective is not a defense of Rommel's politics, nor a blanket exoneration. Rather, it forces attention on the real mechanism by which professional trust evaporated. Not betrayal by a single man, but a cascade of decisions that made competence and conscience incompatible with the policies emanating from the German High Command. The practical consequences were immediate. As the strategic environment changed, Rommel's operational freedom narrowed, supplies dwindled, Allied air power began to dominate more and more of the Mediterranean and North African sky, and the industrial output of the Allies, especially after the United States mobilized, overwhelmed what tactical ingenuity could sustain. More significantly for the Wehrmacht as an institution, these reversals exposed a pattern of decision-making from Berlin that prioritized symbolism and ideological purity over adaptability. For professional soldiers trained to judge outcomes by the balance of forces and the preservation of combat effectiveness, that pattern was not merely a source of tactical frustration. It called into question whether the Supreme Command operated within the same reality in which they were expected to fight. As spring 1943 turned toward summer, the German military faced a rapidly collapsing perimeter. The losses in the East and the failure in the Mediterranean combined to present an unambiguous impression. The war was shifting from a conceivable campaign of controlled expansion to a desperate defense against a materially superior coalition. In that atmosphere, men like Rommel, who had once relished aggressive opportunity, began to adopt a different kind of calculation. If victory was ever to be salvaged, it would require not romantic gestures or ideological steadfastness, but clear-eyed prioritization of resources, the recalibration of strategic goals, and, above all, a willingness in the political leadership to listen to professional advice. The problem, tragically, was that the same leadership, Hitler at its center, appeared less willing than ever to heed counsel.
Rommel's letters and reports from this period show the arc of a soldier moving from energetic confidence to a more cautious, sometimes blunt realism. He advocated for pragmatic measures, better supply lines, concentration of forces where decisive action could still be taken, and the defense of critical positions rather than symbolic stands that offered no strategic value. That tone of counsel sat uncomfortably with a Führer who equated concession with weakness and who increasingly dismissed military assessments that conflicted with his political narrative. For officers watching this dynamic, each refusal was not only a failed policy, but an erosion of the very relationship of trust upon which military structures depend. At the same time, Rommel's prestige had its own costs. The public and political capital he commanded made him an awkward figure inside a regime that prized obedience and the sublimation of all institutions to party aims. Hitler had once cultivated Rommel, That same cultivation created expectations and dependencies that the Führer could later exploit or resent. The soldier who had been useful as a tool of morale now began to speak in tones that suggested a deeper unease. That was dangerous in any totalitarian context. Yet Rommel's disquiet was not simply outspoken dissent. It was the product of a professional conscience colliding with policies that undercut both military success and moral standing. Historians debate the extent to which Rommel's moral qualms were decisive in his shift away from trust in Hitler. Some argue that his primary concern remained purely professional: how to win, or at least how to avoid unnecessary slaughter, while others see a more explicit moral repudiation take hold as reports of atrocities aggregated into undeniable fact. The more cautious interpretation tends to be more persuasive. Rommel's estrangement from Hitler emerged at the intersection of tactical impotence and moral revulsion. Each reinforced the other. Operational failures made the regime's ideological dogmas appear not only unjust but suicidal. The winter of 1943–44 found Germany in a defensive posture on multiple fronts. Eastern operations consumed resources, while the Allies prepared for an eventual cross-channel invasion that would test German shore defenses. Within the officer corps, conversations turned from plans for decisive offensives to desperate calculations of conservation and defense. Many professional soldiers concluded that any further insistence on ideological objectives, territorial maximalism in the East, or punitive reprisals that fed cycles of insurgency, or rigid directives that prevented tactical withdrawals, would only accelerate defeat. That calculus molded the conversations that would eventually center on whether high-level political change was necessary. Discussion ceased to be abstract. It took a more urgent character.
When a military begins to consider political remedies to a leadership it deems irrational, the institutional trust that sustains chains of command begins to fail. Rommel's personal condition at that moment must be understood against this wider backdrop. He had returned to Germany from Africa, physically exhausted and professionally chastened not by a single mistake, but by the arithmetic of attrition. Yet even in withdrawal he remained, in temper and temperament, a man of action. He studied reports, weathered the humiliation of lost theaters, and began to consider the problem of defending the Reich's western approaches. The change in his outlook did not happen as a dramatic conversion scene. It emerged as the accumulation of small, often private reckonings, an officer realizing that the instruments of statecraft were being guided by a will increasingly divorced from military reality. This is the point at which personal unease becomes institutional crisis. The Wehrmacht had always relied upon a tacit compact. Political leaders set policy, but professional soldiers executed with a measure of autonomy and judgment. When political leaders ignored or overruled clear military assessments repeatedly, the compact frayed. For Rommel and many of his colleagues, the erosion of that bond became the decisive issue. It was not merely that they doubted Hitler's strategies on technical grounds, they doubted the leader's capacity to judge the national interest at all. Thereafter, actions were conditioned by a new assumption, that loyalty to the nation could not be equated with blind obedience to one man whose decisions were producing catastrophic loss. The distinction is subtle but pivotal. Officers could remain committed to Germany while ceasing to believe that Hitler served Germany's greater good. That shift, professional respect giving way to institutional mistrust, was the real fault line. It explains why men who had fought and suffered under the swastika could find themselves contemplating extraordinary measures to correct what they saw as a fatal course. By mid-1943, as the smoke of North Africa cleared and the scope of Stalingrad's damage became fully visible, Rommel was a figure caught between two worlds.
He still had a reputation as one of the most capable field commanders alive. He still commanded attention and respect. Yet that very reputation made his later descent more consequential and more dangerous. He was no longer merely a tactician. He was a symbol with the potential to rally professional opinion. Whether he intended to be an instigator of change or simply a blunt-speaking advisor matters less than what he represented, a visible and authoritative critique of Hitler's stewardship. What followed was not an immediate confrontation, but a tightening of pressures. The regime's appetite for dissent decreased as its strategic situation grew worse. The Führer's tolerance for disagreement evaporated in proportion to his own desperation.
The High Command's loss of faith in Hitler was not a single dramatic renunciation, but an accumulating withdrawal, a slow-moving vote of no confidence, administered in whispers, counsel withheld, and a growing willingness to consider political remedies to a military calamity. Rommel's personal trajectory, celebrated commander, doubting realist, and eventually outspoken critic, mirrored the institutional trajectory, from efficient cooperation to guarded opposition. As the year wore on, Rommel's attention turned increasingly to the question of defense. If the war could no longer be won abroad, then the question was how to protect what remained. The strategic logic was simple and grim. Hold where necessary, trade space for time where unavoidable, and conserve forces to blunt the Allied advance. For Rommel, that calculus required political leaders who would prioritize military logic over ideological theater. That requirement, practical, apolitical, and rooted in the duty to his men, would set him on a collision course with the Führer, whose responses to crises had increasingly mixed symbolism, retribution, and stubborn refusal to yield. It is worth pausing to consider the institutional consequences of that collision. Military command is built on predictability. Commanders must trust that orders are not arbitrary, that political direction will take into account military realities, and that sacrifices will serve a coherent strategic end. When political leadership repeatedly subverts those expectations, when orders become ideological performances rather than instruments of coherent strategy, the professional response is not always immediate revolt. Often it begins with an internal withdrawal of confidence. Officers stop trusting the logic of higher orders. They start to keep counsel. They delay. They seek alternatives. That quiet erosion is the mechanism by which the Wehrmacht's high command moved from deference to doubt. Rommel's own private reflections, rarely public, sometimes recorded in letters and recollections after the war, suggest a man who could not reconcile what he had been asked to defend with what he believed was practicable or moral. He did not become an outright political ideologue. He became instead more of a realist about limits. For a soldier of his temperament, that realism was a kind of moral stance, to protect the lives under his command and to advocate for policies that preserved combat power rather than squandered it for monumentally symbolic gestures. Such moderation sounds conservative. In the context of a totalitarian and ideologically driven leadership, it amounted to a radical refusal to subordinate professional judgment to destructive political will. By the end of 1943, the divergence between Hitler's worldview and the Wehrmacht's professional calculus had widened into a gulf. The consequences would not be abstract.
They would play out in desperate councils, in debates over whether to sue for peace or to continue fighting to annihilation, and in the private conversations of officers who had once pledged loyalty to a wartime idea, that the soldier's oath bound them to serve the state, not a single man's fantasies. For Rommel, the moral and strategic disquiet that had grown over the past 2 years was coalescing into an urgent question:
What could be done within the strictures of law and conscience to avert the final ruin of the nation? That is where his story reaches a turning point. A man whose professional reputation gave his words weight now found himself weighing, in private, the acceptability of extraordinary political measures. He rejected assassination as a method. He would later be clear about his distaste for murder as a political instrument. But his increasing willingness to support the removal of Hitler through constitutional or legal means, if such a thing were available, illustrates the depth of the institutional collapse. What began as professional critique had become for Rommel and many of his colleagues an ethical imperative to consider alternatives. It is at this juncture where the professional military judgment, moral revulsion, and political urgency converge that Rommel's individual arc becomes a reflection of a larger institutional crisis. He had been the regime's valuable asset. Now he was a living indictment of its failures. The question that remained, and that would soon open into a far more dangerous phase, was whether those convictions could be turned into effective action without destroying the fabric of the nation the officers claimed to serve. The answer hinged on a sequence of events and choices that would bring the Allies to Western shores and set the Wehrmacht and the Nazi leadership on an irreversible collision course. If you watched the footage of Rommel in 1942, it's easy to see why the regime sold him as a living emblem, decisive, charismatic, effective. By 1944, he was a different image in the archives, wounded, sidelined, and finally dead by his own hand under coercion. Between those images lies the sequence that explains the real reason the German High Command lost faith in Hitler. Not a single betrayal, but an accumulating structural breakdown, strategic misjudgments repeated until professional military judgment and political will could no longer coexist. After North Africa and the retreat from Tunisia, Rommel returned to Germany physically worn and politically alert to a new reality. The theater of mobile, tactical success he excelled in had been closed by hard facts: Allied industrial superiority, increasingly effective air interdiction, and the steady influx of American manpower and materiel. Those realities were less a problem of generalship than of grand strategy, and grand strategy required political leaders who could listen.
For Rommel, the question became less whether he could win isolated victories, and more whether the regime would ever align means with ends. In late 1943 and early 1944, Rommel received one of the most consequential assignments of his career: defend Western Europe. The Allied intention to cross the Channel was by then widely anticipated in German circles. What Rommel saw when he examined the situation was blunt and, to many professional soldiers, unromantic. The most defensible strategy was to prevent an Allied lodgment on the beaches at all costs. If the Allies established a secure beachhead, the numerical and material superiority they could bring to bear would likely overwhelm German defenses inland. Rommel's repeated assessment in reports and conversations with colleagues was stark: stop them at the waterline or face a fight with dramatically worse odds. That assessment had three practical implications. First, coastal defenses had to be prioritized: obstacles, mines, artillery positions, and interlocking fields of fire along vulnerable beaches. Second, local defense had to be backed by mobile reserves, able to counterattack quickly where landings occurred. Third, command arrangements needed clarity. Reserve forces had to be employable without political micromanagement. Each of these requirements collided with realities in Berlin. Rommel threw himself into the problem with characteristic energy. He toured the Atlantic coast, inspected fortifications, and urged the construction of anti-landing measures that would complicate Allied assault craft and impede the buildup of beachheads. He advocated wide use of obstacles,
Belgian and French beaches covered in hedgehogs, Czech hedgehogs, stakes and mines, alongside strong concrete positions where feasible, and, crucially, sufficient mobile armored reserves to smash any lodgment before it matured into an operational base. He proposed shifting limited resources to likely invasion areas and improving coordination between coastal units and armored formations. Two structural obstacles undermined his plan. One was material. The Germans lacked the manpower, fuel, and engineering resources to build a uniformly lethal Atlantic wall from Norway to the Pyrenees. Hundreds of miles of coastline were simply beyond realistic fortification with available resources. The second obstacle was political. Hitler and the High Command's tendency to centralize control over armored reserves. Hitler's known reluctance to release panzer divisions without his explicit authorization, rooted in his fear of sudden collapses on other fronts, and his emotional attachment to symbolic gestures of endurance, meant that even when Rommel identified an invasion sector, his recommended counters could be delayed or blocked. That dynamic cut at the core of professional military confidence. Strategy required timely, flexible application of force. What the regime offered was centralized, slow-moving authority.
The Allies compounded these challenges by conducting an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, that targeted German expectations about where the invasion would come. Fortitude was a comprehensive deception, controlled leaks, double agents, fake radio traffic, dummy tanks and aircraft, and an entire fake army group supposedly commanded by General George Patton, poised in southeast England. The aim was simple: convince the Germans that the main landings would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, and thereby stop them from concentrating forces in the true landing zone. Fortitude worked precisely because of the pre-existing assumptions and command dysfunction inside the German High Command. Many senior German officers, already trained to expect an assault at Pas-de-Calais because of geography and shipping constraints, were predisposed to accept the false picture. Hitler, who favored bold narratives and often preferred dramatic expectations to sober contingency, found the idea of an attack at Calais congenial. The deception's success, therefore, depended on exploiting a weakness in German decision-making, the tendency for political and intelligence filters to confirm what leaders wanted to believe. The result was tragic for German defenders in Normandy. By the time the Allies struck on June 6, 1944, the strategic picture in Berlin and among many commanders on the ground was muddled. Crucial mobile reserves were not released, and the response to the invasion lacked the coordinated, rapid counterattacks Rommel had argued were essential. Rommel was not at his front lines on D-Day. He had been granted leave and was at his home in southern Germany, having returned in part because he believed the defenses he had ordered would hold, or because he needed to confer with political figures and see his family. When news of the landings reached him, the reaction was immediate and grim. He rushed back toward the coast, and as he traveled, the reality of an established Allied lodgment crystallized before him: breaches on multiple beaches, entrenchments being consolidated, and the sluice of Allied reinforcements beginning to pour through the initial footholds. His assessment was unambiguous. What he had feared most had occurred. The Allies had established a beachhead, and the conditions for stopping them before they built up superior combat power no longer existed. Whether D-Day could have been stopped at the waterline is a matter of historical debate and counterfactuals, but Rommel's conclusion was clear to him and to many peers. The German polity had lost the practical capacity to convert defensive measures into sustained strategic effects. Operation Fortitude had magnified that failure by keeping reserves out of action at the moment they were most needed.
More importantly, perhaps, D-Day underlined the pattern that had been growing for 2 years, a disconnect between military necessities and Hitler's political control.
The months after Normandy hardened earlier doubts into explicit opposition. Rommel did not retreat into private complaint, he acted. In mid-July 1944, he took the extraordinary step of writing to Hitler directly. The so-called July 15 letter is a striking document in form and content, blunt, urgent, and lacking the courtly obfuscation that often marked communications in a totalitarian context. In it, Rommel urged the Führer to seek terms with the Western Allies or to step aside so that negotiations could be initiated before the position of Germany deteriorated irretrievably. He framed his counsel in terms of national interest, arguing that prolonging the war would only worsen the country's suffering and destroy any reasonable terms that could be salvaged. That letter shocked the regime. To send such a direct missive to Hitler was to cross a psychological boundary. It signaled not merely professional reproach, but political emergency. It confirmed for many in Berlin that Rommel, far from being a dutiful instrument of the propaganda machine, had moved into a position of political critique. The letter did not advocate violent action. Rommel later and consistently opposed assassination as a political tool. His view was, in brief, that murder could not be the instrument by which a legal or constitutional order was restored. What he would entertain was the removal of Hitler through legalistic or inducement avenues, arrest, forced resignation, or other measures that claimed a veneer of legitimacy. In other words, Rommel's position was that the remedy should preserve the state while ridding it of a leader who had become toxic to national survival. Historians debate how far Rommel's correspondence connected him with the broader resistance that culminated in the July 20 plot. What matters for the question of institutional trust is less the precise legal culpability and more the fact that he became associated, rightly or wrongly, with forces prepared to effect political change. Whether through contact with conspirators, sympathy expressed in private counsels, or the very fact of his letter, Rommel had placed himself outside the comfortable bounds of unquestioning obedience. For a regime whose leader equated dissent with treason, that was a dangerous posture. 2 days after sending his letter, Rommel was severely wounded in a car incident on July 17. The circumstances of the attack remain contested in some accounts, some historians suggesting Allied action, others an unfortunate accident, and a few even hinting at darker possibilities. The safer evidence-based formulation is this: Rommel suffered grave head wounds when his car was hit, leaving him incapacitated for weeks. He underwent surgery and recuperation under guarded circumstances. This inflection point removed him from direct command at the very moment when the July 20 assassination attempt against Hitler unfolded. When Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb failed to kill Hitler on July 20th, the reaction from the regime was immediate and brutal. The purge that followed targeted a wide network of officers and civilians alleged to be conspirators. The investigation swept through the Wehrmacht and the civil administration alike. Arrests, trials, summary executions, and the stripping of honors cascaded through German institutions. In that atmosphere, mere association with dissent, however tentative, became perilous. Rommel, despite his wounds and his earlier stated opposition to assassination, found himself implicated by virtue of contacts and sympathies. The evidence of direct orchestration by Rommel is lacking and disputed. Historians prudently treat his role as ambiguous. What is clear is that the regime used whatever pretext it could gather to neutralize a figure whose influence threatened to galvanize institutional opposition. The options presented to Rommel in the autumn of 1944 illustrate how the regime handled high-profile dissent.
Rather than subject a celebrated field marshal to a public trial that would have exposed fissures within the officer corps and possibly elicited public sympathy, Hitler's regime offered Rommel a grim bargain. Accept responsibility for defeatist attitudes and for sympathy with the conspirators, and take poison, thus preserving honor for your family and the trappings of state recognition, or face public trial, humiliation, and the likely persecution of your family. On October 14, 1944, under pressure from SS officers and representatives of the Nazi state, Rommel consumed cyanide and died. The narrative presented to the public was tightly managed. His funeral was staged as a state occasion, and his death was packaged to avoid martyring a potential rallying figure for military opposition. It was, as many historians have noted, a bureaucratic mechanism of elimination disguised as an act of mercy. What does this sequence tell us about why the High Command lost faith in Hitler? The answer requires layering the institutional dynamics that ran through the period. First, persistent strategic misjudgment sapped professional confidence. The pattern was not one catastrophic error, but a series of operational choices that repeatedly elevated symbolism over sound military judgment. No retreat doctrines at Stalingrad, the maintenance of untenable positions for political reasons, the insistence on holding terrain that offered no strategic advantage. Each of these decisions produced avoidable losses and made the connection between orders given and outcomes expected increasingly opaque to professional officers. Second, ideological intransigence broke the link between means and ends. Hitler's ideological priorities, territorial maximalism in the East, punitive occupation policies, and racialized objectives consistently diverted resources and attention from core military necessities.
When political goals require punishing behavior or symbolic stands rather than operational success, professional soldiers see their tools squandered and their sacrifices rendered meaningless. For men whose metric is effectiveness and survival of their units, that mismatch is corrosive. Third, the moral dimension mattered. Reports of mass executions, repression, and the machinery of genocide on the Eastern Front were not abstract to many officers. They were an ethical rupture that made service in a regime increasingly at odds with recognized norms of warfare uneasy for those who retained any sense of professional ethics. Rommel's personal sensitivity to the welfare of his troops, emphasized by his son's recollections, meant that when political choices endangered soldiers needlessly or made the war an instrument of ideological elimination rather than state defense, loyalty became harder to maintain. Fourth, the centralization of power and the politicization of the Wehrmacht destroyed the institutional trust necessary for coordinated defense. Hitler's habit of directly controlling reserves, issuing contradictory orders, and treating military council as optional meant the High Command could not rely on either consistent strategy or predictable execution. Professional military culture depends on a predictable chain of command where decisions are made based on the best available evidence and where responsibility is acknowledged. As the Führer's style of leadership grew more idiosyncratic and less bound by traditional checks, those foundations crumbled. Finally, the purges and the coercive elimination of dissenters completed the break. Once officers believed that disagreement would be met with arrest, trial, and death, or that speaking plainly might cost their families everything, the calculation changed from how best to execute strategy to how best to survive politically. That withdrawal from candid counsel is precisely what converts tactical setbacks into strategic collapse. When professional advice is suppressed, the quality of decisions degrades further, creating a feedback loop of failure and repression. Rommel's arc captures these dynamics vividly. He began as a soldier whose initiative and tactical acumen made him an asset to a regime that needed military validation. Over time, the same regime that promoted and protected him revealed structural pathologies, strategic errors, ideological obsessions, and moral atrocities that made continued trust impossible for someone whose professional ethic prized competence and the protection of one's men.
His July 15 letter, his refusal to endorse assassination, his injury and subsequent association with conspirators, and his coerced death are successive notes in a lament that was not merely about one man's decline, but about an institution's loss of faith. It is important to resist simplistic readings.
Rommel was not a pure moral hero suddenly awakened. He remained, to the end, a product of his time, shaped by nationalist impulses, a career officer, and a man whose earlier actions had served a regime that committed unprecedented crimes. The High Command's loss of faith was neither a spontaneous conversion to liberal democracy nor an endorsement of better governance. Rather, it was an anguished, pragmatic recognition that Hitler's methods and aims were now destroying what the military saw as the national interest and the conditions necessary for professional soldiering. The consequences of that loss of faith were fatal to Germany's strategic prospects. Instead of a coordinated adaptation to mounting Allied power, the regime tightened its grip, persecuted dissenters, and sought scapegoats. The Wehrmacht's ability to operate effectively under central command withered, as its leaders either were removed or silenced. By the time the Allies pressed into the Reich in 1944 and 1945, German resistance was marked less by coherent defense than by increasingly isolated and politically tainted stands, often enforced by the SS and fanatical elements who prioritized regime survival over rational military calculation. In the end, the real reason the High Command lost faith in Hitler is structural, not personal. It was the realization, born of repeated experience, that this political leadership repeatedly chose ideological spectacle over strategic prudence, that it tolerated and enacted policies of moral atrocity that corrupted the military's purpose, and that it centralized authority so completely that professional advice could neither be trusted to be heard nor practical measures trusted to be implemented. Rommel's trajectory, from the sands of North Africa to the forced silence of October 1944, embodies that erosion of trust. He stands as a tragic exemplar, a soldier who once embodied national hope and later symbolized institutional estrangement from the man who had once commanded assent. There is a final, sobering lesson in this story for students of military and political history. Trust between political leaders and professional military institutions is fragile and cumulative. It can be built by shared purpose and clear, rational decision-making. It can be destroyed by repeated breaches that force professionals to choose between duty and the national interest as they perceive it. Where ideology displaces prudence and political survival becomes more important than national preservation, institutional confidence will give way to calculation about alternatives, legal, political, or, in extremis, conspiratorial. The Wehrmacht's drift away from Hitler was not a single act of betrayal, but the outcome of such a progressive breakdown. If you found this exploration useful, consider subscribing for more in-depth analyses of leadership under pressure and the military decisions that shape history.
For those who want to read deeper, sources and suggested readings are linked in the description. Our episode on Operation Fortitude and Allied Deception goes into the espionage and counterintelligence side in greater detail. Rommel's life and death do not cleanly resolve the moral ambiguities of the time. They instead illuminate the tragic calculus of professional men caught between oath and conscience, between tactical loyalty and national survival. The High Command's loss of faith in Hitler was the consequence of choices that made further cooperation between soldier and sovereign impossible. Once that trust was gone, so too was Germany's last realistic hope of preserving itself short of catastrophic capitulation. The pages of the final year, purges, forced silences, and the collapse of coherent leadership are the costly proof of that truth.